The hum of the engines is a lullaby for most, a promise of journeys and new beginnings. But on British Airways Flight 226, suspended 7 miles above the Atlantic, that gentle hum was the soundtrack to a storm. Not a storm of wind and rain, but one of venom and prejudice brewing in the heart of Seat 7A. A storm that would put one woman's life in the hands of the very person she'd tried to tear down. This isn't just a story about a mid-air medical emergency. It's about what happens when arrogance collides with integrity, when hate is forced to beg for help from the one it despises. It's the story of how a single moment of crisis can strip away everything privilege, status, and bigotry, leaving only a desperate plea for the humanity you refused to see. The atmosphere inside the Boeing 787 was a familiar symphony of controlled chaos. Passengers shuffled down the aisles of the sold-out British Airways flight from JFK to London Heathrow, a river of tired travelers and eager tourists. The cabin crew, immaculate in their navy blue uniforms, moved with practiced efficiency, their smiles a thin veneer over the weariness of a transatlantic red-eye. For Dr. Imani Hayes, it was a welcome escape. She was heading to a medical conference in London, a brief respite from the grueling hours of her residency at a demanding New York hospital. Imani found her seat 12B, an aisle seat in the premium economy cabin. It wasn't first class, but it was a comfortable upgrade. She'd treated herself to a small reward for a year of relentless work. She was a tall, graceful woman in her early 30s, her hair styled in intricate braids that cascaded over her shoulders. Dressed in comfortable but stylish travel attire, she exuded a quiet confidence. She stowed her carry-on, a worn leather satchel filled with medical journals, and a well-loved novel in the overhead compartment, and settled in, looking forward to a few hours of sleep before a packed week of seminars. The boarding process continued, and the seat next to her, 12A, remained empty. A small blessing, she thought, hoping for a little extra room to stretch out. But her quiet optimism was shattered by the arrival of a woman who seemed to carry her own turbulent weather system with her. Caroline Covington was in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored cashmere tracksuit that likely cost more than Imani's entire trip. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her face a mask of taut, expensive maintenance. Diamonds glittered on her fingers and dripped from her earlobes. She was followed by her husband, a portly man named Robert, who looked perpetually flustered and trailed in her wake like a weary tugboat. Caroline stopped abruptly at row 12, her cold blue eyes scanning the seat numbers with disdain. She held a boarding pass for 7A in business class, but her husband Robert held the pass for 12A. "This simply will not do." "Robert," she announced, her voice a sharp, imperious blade that cut through the cabin's low hum. "You can't possibly expect me to sit up there all by myself while you're back here in the cheap seats." Robert mumbled something about a last-minute booking and a full cabin. Caroline waved a dismissive hand, the diamonds on her wrist catching the light. Her gaze then fell upon Imani, who was trying to discreetly read an article on her phone. Caroline's eyes narrowed, sweeping over Imani from head to toe in a silent, critical appraisal that was anything but subtle. "Excuse me," Caroline said, her tone dripping with condescension. She wasn't speaking to a flight attendant. She was addressing Imani directly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my husband's seat." Imani looked up, offering a polite but reserved smile. "Yes, 12A. I'm in 12B. "I see," Caroline said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Well, things have changed. My seat is in business class. My husband will be taking that seat, and I will be sitting here, next to the window." She didn't ask. She stated it as an unassailable fact. Before Imani could respond, Robert interjected nervously. "Honey, we can't just switch seats. The manifest is set. We can ask the flight attendant." "Don't be ridiculous, Robert," Caroline snapped, turning her glare on him. "It's a simple request." She turned back to Imani, her smile thin and frosty. "I'm sure you wouldn't mind moving, would you? Perhaps you can find another aisle seat further back. It would be much more convenient for everyone." The implication hung heavy in the air. "It would be more convenient for me." The phrase "further back" was delivered with a subtle but unmistakable emphasis. Imani kept her composure, her years of dealing with difficult patients and their demanding families having forged a shield of professional calm. "I'm sorry, but I specifically chose this seat, and I'd prefer to stay here," she said, her voice even and firm. Caroline's facade of civility cracked. A flicker of disbelief, then outright annoyance crossed her face. It was clear she was a woman who was not used to hearing the word no. "I don't think you understand," Caroline said, her voice lowering into a conspiratorial yet menacing whisper. "My husband and I need to sit together. I have a condition. I need him nearby. Surely you can understand that. It's a matter of compassion." Imani, a medical doctor, recognized the vague, manipulative appeal to sympathy for what it was. "I'm sorry to hear that," she replied calmly. "Perhaps the flight attendant can assist you in finding 2 seats together, somewhere else on the plane." At that moment, a flight attendant named Michael, a cheerful man with kind eyes, arrived at the row. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his smile ready. Caroline immediately turned her charm on him, transforming into a frail, concerned wife. "Oh, thank goodness." "This young woman," she said, gesturing towards Imani without looking at her, "is refusing to move so I can sit with my husband. I have a severe anxiety disorder, and I simply must have him next to me during the flight. It's a medical necessity." Michael looked from Caroline's perfectly composed face to Imani's calm demeanor. He was caught in the middle. "Ma'am, I understand, but the flight is completely full. We can't just move passengers who have pre-selected their seats." "Then find someone else to move." Caroline insisted, her voice rising. Her eyes darted around the cabin. "What about him?" She pointed to a young backpacker a few rows back. "Or her." She indicated an elderly woman. Her gaze landed back on Imani, and a venomous certainty settled in her eyes. Why must it be so difficult? I'm sure she wouldn't mind. People are usually so accommodating. The word people was coded a veiled reference that both Imani and Michael understood perfectly. It was a classic microaggression, subtle enough to be deniable, but sharp enough to wound. Michael's professional smile tightened. "Ma'am, I cannot force another passenger to give up their seat. Dr. Hayes has the right to remain where she is." He had glanced at the passenger manifest on his tablet, noting Imani's title. The use of doctor only seemed to enrage Caroline further. Her eyes widened in mock surprise as she looked at Imani again, this time with open derision. "Doctor!" She scoffed, a laugh catching in her throat. She leaned closer to her husband, but her voice was loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear clearly. "Oh, Robert, isn't that just precious? A doctor of what sociology, basket weaving?" "I'm sure it's one of those affirmative action things. They just hand out degrees to anyone these days to fill a quota." The cabin, which had been buzzing with conversations, grew quiet. The passengers in the nearby rows froze, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Some looked down, suddenly fascinated by their shoes. Others stared with undisguised shock. The air thickened with a collective unspoken discomfort. Imani felt a hot flush of anger rise in her chest, a familiar bitter taste. It wasn't the first time her credentials or her presence in a space of privilege had been questioned because of her race. But the sheer audacity, the public nature of the humiliation, was staggering. She took a slow, deliberate breath, refusing to give this woman the satisfaction of a reaction. She looked Caroline directly in the eye, her own gaze steady and unwavering. "I'm a doctor of medicine," Imani said, her voice dangerously quiet, but clear as a bell. "I'm a trauma surgeon, and I will not be moving from my seat." The finality in her tone was unmistakable. The storm had broken, and the calm that followed was heavy with the promise of more to come. Defeated for the moment, Caroline glared at Imani one last time before huffing and making a show of squeezing past her to take the window seat, leaving her husband to sit next to Imani. Robert Covington, red-faced and mortified, sank into seat 12, refusing to make eye contact with the woman his wife had just so cruelly insulted. The cabin door closed, the engine spooled up, and as the plane began its inexorable journey across the dark ocean, a far more personal and volatile journey had just begun in row 12. As the plane ascended through the clouds, a tense and suffocating silence enveloped row 12. Robert Covington sat rigidly in the middle seat, a human buffer zone between his wife's simmering rage and Imani's resolute calm. He stared blankly at the seatback screen, his face a mask of crimson embarrassment. Caroline, trapped by the window, fumed silently, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if to physically contain her indignation. Imani tried to retreat into her own world. She pulled out her noise-cancelling headphones and opened her novel, but the words on the page blurred. The ugly scene replayed in her mind, each condescending word, each dismissive glance, a fresh sting. It was the casual, entitled nature of the prejudice that was so exhausting. The assumption that her space, her comfort, her very presence was negotiable. The disbelief that a black woman could be a doctor, immediately followed by the dismissive, racist explanation of affirmative action. It was a classic playbook of bigotry, and Caroline Covington had run every play with practiced ease. The dinner service began a welcome distraction. When the flight attendant, a kind woman named Susan, reached their row, she addressed Imani first, her smile warmer than strictly necessary. "Doctor Hayes, may I get you something to drink before your meal?" she asked pointedly, using Imani's title again. It was a small gesture of solidarity, and Imani felt a flicker of gratitude. "Just some water, please." "Thank you, Susan," Imani replied, her own smile genuine. When Susan turned to Caroline, the atmosphere frosted over once more. "And for you, ma'am, a gin and tonic, make it a double." "And be quick about it," Caroline snapped, not even bothering to look at her. Throughout the meal, Caroline kept up a running commentary, a series of stage whispers directed at her husband, but intended for Imani's ears. "The chicken is dreadfully dry, Robert. You'd think for the price of these tickets they could manage something edible," she complained. A moment later, "Can you believe the state of air travel these days? They'll let just anyone into the premium cabins now. There's no standard of decorum anymore." Each comment was a carefully aimed dart. Imani focused on her food, chewing slowly, refusing to acknowledge the provocations. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on them. An older gentleman across the aisle gave her a brief apologetic smile. A young couple in front kept glancing back, their expressions a mixture of pity and outrage. The silence of the many, however, was deafening. It was the complicity of non-confrontation, the desire to avoid a scene that allowed bullies like Caroline to thrive. After the meal trays were cleared, Robert finally seemed to muster a shred of courage. He leaned slightly towards Imani, keeping his voice low so his wife wouldn't overhear. "I am truly sorry about that." He mumbled, his gaze fixed on his lap. "My wife, she gets very anxious when she flies. She's not herself. It was a weak, pathetic excuse, and they both knew it." Imani looked at him, her expression unreadable. She thought of all the times she'd heard similar justifications for racism. He's from a different generation. She didn't mean it like that. They're just stressed. It was the language of appeasement, the rhetoric that protected the perpetrator and placed the burden of forgiveness on the victim. "Anxiety doesn't make you a racist," Imani said quietly, but with a steel edge to her voice. "It just reveals what's already there." Robert flinched, as if struck. He had no response. He shrank back into his seat, the conversation over. He had done his perfunctory duty, offered the token apology, and could now retreat back into his comfortable silence, absolved. Imani closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep. But Caroline's poison had seeped into her thoughts. She thought about her journey. The endless nights, studying the mountains of debt, the grueling shifts. She remembered the dismissive academic advisors who suggested she pursue a less challenging field. She recalled the patients who refused her care, demanding to see a real doctor. She had fought every step of the way, proving her worth time and time again in a system designed to question it. And yet here, at 35,000 feet, all her achievements, her degrees, her skill could be erased by one woman's sneer and the color of her skin. An hour later, Caroline needed to use the restroom. She tapped Imani sharply on the shoulder. Not a polite "excuse me," but a demanding, impatient tap. Imani opened her eyes and slowly, deliberately unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up to let her pass. As Caroline squeezed by, she didn't just brush past Imani. She shoved, her body language radiating contempt. When she returned, she paused before sitting down, her eyes once again raking over Imani. "You know," she said, her voice laced with a syrupy false concern, "I hope you're a better doctor than you are a seatmate. Though I doubt it. Someone like you probably got your medical license out of a cereal box. It must be terribly difficult to keep up when you're so out of your depth." This time the attack was so direct, so personal, it broke through Imani's control. She turned in her seat to face Caroline fully. "And what exactly do you mean?" Imani asked, her voice low and steady. "By someone like me?" Caroline gave a theatrical, innocent shrug. "Oh, you know, an affirmative action hire. Given a leg up because of, well, you know. It's not your fault, dear. It's the system. But it does put the rest of us at risk, doesn't it? Having people in important jobs who aren't really qualified." The accusation was monstrous. It wasn't just an insult. It was an attack on her competence, her identity, her life's work. It was an insinuation that her presence as a black female surgeon was a danger to society. Before Imani could formulate a response that wouldn't get her arrested, the flight attendant Michael reappeared. He had likely been monitoring the situation. "Mrs. Covington," he said, his voice firm and professional. "I need to ask you to stop harassing the other passengers. If you continue, the captain will be notified, and you could be met by authorities upon landing." Caroline gasped, clutching her chest in mock horror. Harassing. I was simply making conversation. This is unbelievable. I am a paying customer. I will be filing a formal complaint against you and this entire airline. That is your right, ma'am, Michael said, unmoved. But for the remainder of this flight, you will either be silent or you will be in violation of federal aviation regulations. The choice is yours. He gave Imani a quick, reassuring nod before moving on. Thwarted. Caroline slumped back into her seat, her face a thunderous mask of fury. She shot one last, hate-filled glare at Imani, a silent promise of retribution. Then she turned to the window and refused to look back. The cabin lights dimmed, and an uneasy truce settled over the aircraft. But the whispers of prejudice had done their damage. They hung in the recycled air, a toxic cloud that isolated and suffocated. Imani leaned her head back, the injustice of it all a heavy weight on her soul. She felt a profound sense of weariness, a deep-seated exhaustion that had nothing to do with the late hour. She closed her eyes, praying for the dawn, praying for the journey to be over. She had no idea that for one person in her row, the journey was about to come to a terrifying, premature end. 3 hours into the flight, the aircraft was a cocoon of relative peace, gliding smoothly through the dark sky, somewhere over the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic. The cabin was dark, with only the dim glow of seat-back screens and the occasional pinprick of an overhead reading light disturbing the slumber of its occupants. Most passengers were asleep, lulled by the monotonous drone of the engines. Imani had finally managed to drift into a light, restless sleep, her novel resting on her lap. The tranquility was shattered by a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and unnatural, a strangled gasp that cut through the engine's hum. Imani's eyes snapped open. Her senses, honed by years in the emergency room, were instantly on high alert. The sound had come from right beside her. Robert Covington was asleep, his head lolling against the headrest, a slight snore escaping his lips. But Caroline in the window seat was bolt upright. Her eyes were wide with panic, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at her throat. A faint, high-pitched wheezing sound escaped her with every desperate, shallow breath. Caroline. "What is it?" Robert mumbled, woken by the commotion. Caroline couldn't answer. Her face, pale to begin with, was rapidly turning a frightening shade of blue around her lips. Her chest heaved, but she was getting no air. She looked at her husband, her expression one of pure terror. Imani didn't hesitate. Her professional instincts overrode every personal feeling of anger and resentment she held for this woman. She saw not the bigot who had insulted her, but a human being in acute distress. "She can't breathe," Imani said, her voice sharp and authoritative, cutting through Robert's sleepy confusion. She leaned over him, her eyes quickly assessing Caroline. "Her airway is closing. It looks like anaphylaxis." Robert stared, his mind failing to grasp the severity of the situation. Anaphylaxis, but she just had the chicken. She's never been allergic to chicken. "It doesn't have to be the chicken," Imani said, quickly unbuckling her seatbelt. "It could be a cross-contamination. Peanuts, shellfish, anything. Did she eat the mixed nuts they served before the meal?" Robert's eyes widened in horror. "Yes, she loves cashews, but she's never had a reaction before. A severe allergy can develop at any time in life." Imani explained, her mind already racing through treatment protocols. "We need to act now. Press the call button. Tell them it's a medical emergency. Ask them if they have an epinephrine auto-injector, an EpiPen in their medical kit. Go." Her command galvanized Robert into action. He fumbled for the call button, his hands shaking. Within seconds, the flight attendant, Michael, was there, his face etched with concern. "What's happening?" "My wife. She can't breathe," Robert stammered. Michael saw Caroline's cyanotic lips and the desperate struggle for air, and his training kicked in. He spoke urgently into the cabin phone. "This is Michael in premium economy. We have a code Alpha medical emergency at seat 12A. Passenger is in respiratory distress, possibly anaphylactic shock." The calm of the cabin was instantly broken. Lights came on. Passengers began to stir their sleepy faces, turning to alarm as they saw the unfolding crisis. "Is there a doctor on board?" Michael's voice boomed over the intercom, the familiar, dreaded announcement that every frequent flyer hopes never to hear. "We have a medical emergency. If there is a medical professional on the flight, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately." The request hung in the air. For a moment, there was only the sound of panicked breathing and hushed whispers. Robert looked around wildly, his face pale with fear, searching for a savior. Other passengers looked around too, their gazes filled with a mixture of morbid curiosity and helplessness. Imani had already taken charge. She was kneeling in the aisle next to Caroline, her fingers pressed against the woman's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but it was thready and rapid. Tachycardia. Her blood pressure was clearly dropping. They were running out of time. "I'm a doctor," Imani said to Michael, her voice cutting through the rising panic. It was a simple statement of fact, but in that moment, it carried the weight of a divine proclamation. Michael's head whipped around. His eyes met Imani's, and a wave of relief washed over his face as he recognized her. He remembered the earlier confrontation, Caroline's sneering dismissal of Imani's profession. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice filled with a new level of respect. "What do you need?" "The primary medical kit. Now," Imani commanded. "And tell the captain to start looking for the nearest airport for an emergency diversion. She's going into shock. We have maybe 5 minutes to reverse this before she goes into full cardiac arrest." Robert Covington stared at Imani, his jaw slack. The woman, his wife, had belittled, the woman she had accused of being an unqualified affirmative action hire, was now the only person on a plane full of 300 people 7 miles above a black ocean who could save her life. The full crushing weight of his wife's cruelty and the cosmic twist of their predicament hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at his wife, whose struggles were becoming weaker, her eyes starting to glaze over. Then he looked at Imani, whose face was a mask of intense, focused concentration. The arrogance and entitlement that had defined his world just minutes before had evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He stumbled into the aisle, his hands clasped together as if in prayer, his voice a choked, desperate whisper. "Please." He begged, his eyes welling with tears as he looked at Imani. "Please, save her. I'll do anything. I'll give you anything. Please, you have to save my wife." The sudden descent had begun, not of the aircraft, but of a proud, prejudiced woman brought crashing down to earth by her own body's betrayal. Forced to place her life in the hands of the very person whose humanity she had so vehemently denied. And for Imani Hayes, the reluctant savior, the ultimate test of her oath and her grace was about to begin. The cabin lights cast a harsh, sterile glare on the scene in row 12, turning it into a makeshift emergency room. The quiet murmur of the aircraft was now a backdrop to a frantic life-or-death drama. Passengers craned their necks, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination as the flight crew cleared the aisle, creating a small, insulated space for Imani to work. For a split second, as Robert Covington begged her to save his wife, Imani felt a dizzying vortex of emotions. The anger from Caroline's relentless racist insults was still a raw, open wound. A dark, cynical part of her mind whispered a bitter thought. This is karma. This is what she deserves. The thought was ugly and fleeting, but it was there a testament to the depth of the hurt Caroline had inflicted. She saw Caroline's sneering face, heard her dismissive words echoing in her head. A doctor of what basket weaving, and I'm sure you got your license out of a cereal box. The temptation to hesitate, to let the universe deliver its own brutal justice, was a cold, heavy stone in her gut. Why should she help this woman? This woman who saw her not as a fellow human being, let alone a highly trained professional, but as an inferior, a quota, a threat. Saving her would validate nothing. Caroline would likely wake up, and once the danger had passed, revert to her old hateful self. Perhaps even spinning a narrative where she was the victim. But then Imani looked down at Caroline. The woman's face was now a ghastly shade of grey-blue, her lips tinged with purple. The arrogant, imperious woman from before was gone, replaced by a terrified, fragile human being fighting for every last breath. The wheezing had become a barely audible squeak. Her eyes, wide with terror, met Imani's for a brief, lucid moment. In them, Imani saw not hatred, but a raw, primal plea for life. And in that instant, the doctor in her extinguished the anger. The Hippocratic oath she had taken was not conditional. It didn't have a clause that said, first do no harm, unless the patient is a racist who has personally insulted you. Her duty was to preserve life, any life. To deny care, to hesitate, would be to betray her profession, her principles, and ultimately herself. It would mean allowing Caroline's bigotry to infect her own soul, to make her something she was not. "Get me that kit!" Imani shouted, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for doubt. Michael and another flight attendant. Susan arrived with a large red case, the plane's advanced medical kit. They placed it on the floor beside her. "What do you need, doctor?" Susan asked, her hands steady, despite the tension. Imani's hands were a blur of efficient motion as she unzipped the case, her mind cataloguing its contents. "I need the epinephrine. It should be in a pre-filled syringe or an auto-injector, and a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope." Susan quickly found the items. The kit contained 2 EpiPen auto-injectors, a small miracle. Imani ripped the packaging off one of the EpiPens. "Robert, I need you to hold her leg still." "Right here," she instructed, pointing to Caroline's thigh. "I need to inject this directly into the muscle." Robert, shaking but desperate to help, knelt and gripped his wife's leg. His face was streaked with tears, his earlier bluster completely gone, replaced by the terrified vulnerability of a man watching his partner die. Imani pulled the safety cap off the injector. "This is going to be a hard jab," she warned. With a practiced, firm motion, she pressed the tip of the EpiPen against Caroline's outer thigh and pushed. There was a sharp click as the spring-loaded needle deployed, delivering a life-saving dose of epinephrine into her system. Imani held it in place for a count of 10 to ensure the full dose was administered. "Okay, that's in," she said, her focus absolute. "Now the blood pressure cuff. I need a baseline." She wrapped the cuff around Caroline's arm and inflated it, placing the stethoscope to her ear. The cabin was silent, save for the beep of the machine and the hum of the engines. "Blood pressure is 70/40, Imani announced grimly. "She's in profound shock. The epinephrine should start working soon, but we need to get her blood pressure up. Let's elevate her legs." Michael and Robert carefully lifted Caroline's legs, resting them on the armrest of the seat. The goal was to redirect blood flow back to her vital organs. Imani listened to Caroline's chest with the stethoscope. The severe wheezing the stridor was still present, but perhaps a fraction less pronounced. The epinephrine was starting to open her airways. "Is there an oxygen tank in the kit?" Imani asked. "Yes, doctor," Michael confirmed, already pulling it out. "Good. Get the mask on her. Set it to 10 liters per minute." As Michael fitted the oxygen mask over Caroline's face, Imani prepared a second injection. "I need to start an IV line. I need fluids to support her blood pressure. Get me the saline bag and an IV start kit." This was the part she dreaded. Finding a vein on a patient in circulatory collapse in a moving airplane cabin with poor lighting was a nightmare scenario. Her first attempt failed, the vein collapsing under the needle. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. She took a deep breath, calming her own racing heart. "You've done this 100 times in worse conditions," she told herself. Focus. On the second try, she was successful. She saw the telltale flash of blood in the catheter. With deft fingers, she secured the line and opened the saline drip wide, letting the fluid rush into Caroline's system. Slowly, miraculously, the tide began to turn. A faint tinge of pink started to return to Caroline's lips. Her breathing, while still labored, became deeper, the terrifying wheeze softening into a hoarse rasp. Imani checked her blood pressure again. 90/60. It's coming up. She's responding. A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the small crowd of crew and passengers gathered nearby. Robert sobbed openly, his head bowed in a mixture of gratitude and shame. Caroline's eyes fluttered open. They were no longer wild with terror, but hosed and confused. Through the clear plastic of the oxygen mask, her gaze found Imani's. The cold blue eyes that had glared at her with such contempt hours earlier now looked at her with a dawning, horrified understanding. She saw the IV line in her own arm, the oxygen mask on her face, and the dark-skinned woman in front of her, the unqualified doctor who was single-handedly pulling her back from the brink of death. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Yet her eyes spoke volumes. They held a question, a plea, and a sliver of something that looked like profound, soul-crushing shame. In that moment, stripped of her wealth, her status, and her bigotry, Caroline Covington was just a patient, and Imani Hayes was just her doctor. The titles they had fought over earlier had been rendered meaningless, replaced by the most fundamental roles in human existence, the saved and the savior. And the savior in this case was the one she had been so determined to prove was unworthy. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the race was far from over. Caroline Covington was stabilized, but she was not safe. Anaphylaxis could have a biphasic reaction, a second equally severe wave of symptoms that could occur hours after the first. Furthermore, the profound drop in her blood pressure could have caused damage to her kidneys or heart. She needed to be in a hospital, not in a pressurized tube miles above the ocean. Imani stayed by her side, kneeling in the cramped aisle, constantly monitoring her vital signs. The adrenaline that had flooded her system was beginning to ebb, replaced by a focused clinical vigilance. The premium economy aisle had become her ICU. "Michael," Imani said, her voice calm but insistent. "I need an update from the captain. Where are we diverting to?" "We need to land as soon as possible. Captain's already on it, Doctor," Michael replied, his respect for her evident in his tone. "We were over the North Atlantic just past the point of no return. The closest viable airport with the necessary medical facilities is Shannon, Ireland." He's already rerouted. Estimated time to landing is 1 hour and 45 minutes. 1 hour and 45 minutes. It felt like an eternity. Anything could happen in that time. Okay, Imani said, nodding. We need to be prepared. Does the kit have any corticosteroids, methylprednisolone, or something similar? And an antihistamine, like diphenhydramine? Susan, who had become Imani's de facto nurse, quickly scanned the kit's manifest. Yes, we have both. Vials for injection. Good. Let's get them ready. The steroids will help prevent a secondary reaction, and the antihistamine will manage the ongoing allergic response. I'll need to administer them through her IV line. As Susan prepared the medications, Imani continued her assessment of Caroline. The woman was now fully conscious, though weak and disoriented. She kept trying to pull off the oxygen mask. Caroline. My name is Dr. Imani Hayes, Imani said, leaning close so she could be heard over the mask and the engine noise. You've had a severe allergic reaction. The oxygen is helping you breathe. You need to keep it on. Caroline's eyes, still wide, locked onto Imani's face. The name registered. Dr. Hayes. The doctor she had ridiculed. She made a small choking sound, a sob of humiliation. Tears welled and spilled down her temples, disappearing into her expensive blonde hair. Robert, seeing his wife's distress, knelt beside her. It's okay, darling, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She saved you. This doctor. She saved your life. He looked at Imani, his own eyes swimming with a desperate, humbling gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, doctor. What you did, it was a miracle. Imani gave a curt nod. Her focus entirely on her patient. This wasn't about gratitude or apologies. It was about getting this woman to a hospital alive. Keep her calm, she told Robert. Panic will increase her heart rate and put more strain on her system. For the next hour, Imani worked tirelessly. She administered the steroids and antihistamines, carefully calculating the dosages based on Caroline's estimated weight. She monitored the saline drip, ensuring Caroline was getting enough fluid without being overloaded. She took her blood pressure every 15 minutes, calling out the numbers to Susan, who dutifully recorded them on a napkin from the drinks trolley. The other passengers watched in hushed silence. The earlier drama of prejudice had been completely eclipsed by the stark reality of life and death. They were witnessing something extraordinary. They saw not a black woman or a white woman, but a doctor with an almost supernatural calm, fighting to save a life against the odds. Her skill was undeniable, her authority absolute. The racist insults Caroline had hurled now seemed not just cruel, but absurdly, tragically ignorant. The woman she had deemed unqualified was demonstrating a level of competence that was nothing short of heroic. About 30 minutes before landing, Caroline's blood pressure began to dip again. 85/50. It's dropping, Imani said, a sharp edge of concern in her voice. She's not holding her pressure. The first dose of epinephrine is wearing off. She reached for the second EpiPen. Robert, I need to give her another dose, same as before. Hold her other leg. Robert complied instantly. Imani administered the second injection, her movements just as swift and sure as the first. Then she looked at Susan. Do you have any more epinephrine in this kit? Susan's face fell. No, doctor. The kit only stocks 2 auto-injectors. Imani's jaw tightened. They had no more safety nets. This second dose had to be enough to get them to the ground where paramedics and a fully stocked ambulance would be waiting. The race against time had become a desperate sprint to the finish line. Tell the captain we need priority landing and paramedics on the tarmac the second we touch down, Imani ordered Michael. Tell them we have a patient in refractory anaphylactic shock, responsive to epinephrine, but we've exhausted our supply." Michael was already on the phone to the cockpit, relaying the message. The final minutes of the flight were the most tense of all. Imani never left Caroline's side, her fingers frequently checking the pulse in the woman's wrist, her eyes glued to her patient's face, watching for any change in her breathing or skin color. Finally, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. "Cabin crew, please prepare for landing." The plane began its final descent into Shannon. Through the window, the green fields of Ireland emerged from the pre-dawn darkness, a welcome sight. As the wheels touched the tarmac with a gentle bump, a ripple of applause and relieved sighs spread through the cabin. But Imani wasn't relieved yet. Her work wasn't done. As the plane taxied towards the terminal, the flashing lights of an ambulance became visible. The moment the aircraft came to a stop and the doors opened, a team of Irish paramedics rushed up the jet bridge and onto the plane. "I'm Dr. Hayes," Imani said, meeting the lead paramedic. "This is Mrs. Covington, 50s, suspected anaphylaxis to nuts. She went into respiratory distress and hypotensive shock. I've given her 2 doses of intramuscular epinephrine, 50 milligirals of diphenhydramine, and 125 milligirals of methylprednisolone via IV, plus a liter of saline. Her last blood pressure was 95/60, but she's unstable." The paramedic, a burly man with a kind face, listened intently, his eyes wide with admiration for the detailed and professional handover. "Right, doctor. You've done a phenomenal job. We'll take it from here." His team moved with swift efficiency, transferring Caroline onto a stretcher, hooking her up to their portable monitors. As they wheeled her towards the door, Caroline, still weak but lucid, lifted a trembling hand. Her eyes found Imani's one last time. "Thank you," she rasped the words, muffled by the oxygen mask. It was a small, inadequate phrase, yet it contained the weight of a life reclaimed, a worldview shattered, and a debt that could never be repaid. Imani simply nodded, watching as they carried her off the plane, out of the artificial world of the aircraft, and back into the real world, where hopefully she would have a chance to reckon with the ugliness of her own heart. The race against time was over. Imani had won. The departure of the paramedics left a strange vacuum in the cabin. The immediate life-threatening tension had dissipated, replaced by a thick, contemplative silence. The remaining passengers who had been held on the plane were now free to deplane for the unscheduled stopover in Shannon. But for a moment, no one moved. All eyes were on Dr. Imani Hayes. She was still kneeling in the aisle, the detritus of the emergency scattered around her, empty syringe. Packages, sterile wipes, the plastic cap from the EpiPen. She looked physically and emotionally drained. The mask of the unflappable professional had slipped slightly, revealing the profound weariness beneath. She had just spent 2 hours in a state of hypervigilance, making life-or-death decisions with limited resources, all while battling her own complex feelings about the patient she was saving. Slowly, she began to gather the medical waste, her movements methodical. The flight attendant, Michael, came over and gently stopped her. "Doctor, please. We'll take care of this. You should sit down." As Imani rose to her feet, a spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. It started with the young couple in front of her, then spread row by row. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a soft, respectful ovation, a heartfelt acknowledgement of the grace and skill they had just witnessed. People smiled at her, nodded their heads in admiration. The older man from across the aisle reached out and briefly touched her arm. "You were magnificent, young lady. Truly magnificent." Imani was taken aback. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. She simply murmured a quiet, "Thank you," her eyes slightly misty. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated respect, a stark contrast to the ugliness that had preceded the crisis. In this shared space for this brief moment, her skin color was irrelevant. They saw only her competence, her humanity. Robert Covington remained standing awkwardly in the aisle, looking lost and utterly broken. The ambulance was gone, his wife was gone, and he was left to face the woman who held an unpayable debt over his family. He wrung his hands, his face a miserable portrait of shame. He approached Imani cautiously, as one might approach a celestial being. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his voice cracking. There are no words. You saved her." He reached into the pocket of his expensive jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a pen. It was an instinctive gesture for a man like him. A man for whom money was the universal language, the solution to every problem, the balm for every wound. "Please," he said, his voice trembling as he offered them to her. "Let me compensate you for your time, for your expertise. Name any price, anything. A new car, a down payment on a house, your medical school loans. Whatever you want, it's yours." Imani looked from the checkbook in his hand to the desperate, pleading look in his eyes. She saw in that gesture the same transactional worldview that had allowed his wife to treat her with such dismissive contempt. They believed everything and everyone had a price tag. They saw her skill not as a part of her, an extension of her character and dedication, but as a service that could be purchased, a debt that could be cleared with a signature. Accepting his money would in a way validate their worldview. It would reduce her heroic, compassionate act to a simple transaction. She held up a hand, gently but firmly stopping him. "Put that away, Mr. Covington," she said, her voice quiet, but imbued with an unshakable moral authority. The entire cabin seemed to lean in to listen. "My actions tonight were not a service for sale," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I am a doctor. I took an oath. What I did was not for you or for your wife. It was for the oath. It was for the principle that every life is worth saving." She took a step closer, and her voice dropped, becoming more personal, yet carrying a weight that resonated with everyone who could hear. "You cannot pay me for what I did. There isn't enough money in your bank account to cover the cost of a human life, or the cost of human dignity." She paused, letting the words sink in. Robert looked as if she had physically struck him. "The debt your wife owes is not to me," Imani said, her voice softening slightly, not with pity but with a profound sense of clarity. "The debt she owes is to herself. She has to live with the fact that her life was saved by someone she considered less than human, by a woman she insulted and belittled because of the color of my skin. She has to reconcile the fact that the unqualified affirmative action hire had the skills and the grace to keep her alive. That is her burden to carry," Imani concluded, "and it is a debt that no amount of money can ever repay. All I want from you, from both of you, is that you remember that. Remember that the world is filled with people you may not understand or value, but they are people nonetheless. Your respect is not a gift you bestow upon those you deem worthy. It is a basic requirement of human decency. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm very tired." With that, she walked past him back to her seat and sank into it. Robert Covington stood frozen in the aisle, the checkbook still in his hand, looking like a relic from a forgotten world. The moral clarity of her words had left him stripped bare. He had tried to settle the score in the only way he knew how, and she had rejected it, reframing the entire event not as a financial transaction, but as a profound moral reckoning. The other passengers began to file off the plane, their glances at Robert a mixture of pity and contempt. He was a wealthy man, a powerful man, but in that moment he had never seemed so small. The unspoken debt was real, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it would follow him and his wife for the rest of their lives. Weeks after the emergency landing in Shannon, the world had moved on. The passengers of Flight 226 had continued their journeys, the incident becoming a shocking travel story to be told at dinner parties. Caroline Covington had made a full recovery at a private hospital in Ireland before quietly returning to her lavish home in Greenwich, Connecticut. For a moment it seemed as though the dramatic mid-air reckoning might fade into memory, a private lesson learned, but with no public consequence. But someone on that plane had been filming. A young tech entrepreneur in the row behind Imani, deeply moved by what he'd witnessed, had discreetly recorded several clips on his phone. He had captured Caroline's initial venomous tirade, her sneering dismissal of Imani's credentials. He had captured the panic of the medical emergency. And he had captured Imani's final, powerful speech to Robert Covington, her calm refusal of his money, and her profound lesson on human decency. He debated what to do with the footage, but after seeing a news report about a medical charity facing accusations of racial bias, he felt compelled to act. He edited the clips together, wrote a detailed account of the events, and posted it online. The video went viral overnight. It was shared millions of times on Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. News outlets picked it up. Plain Racist and Dr. Angel started trending. Imani Hayes and Caroline Covington were suddenly thrust into the international spotlight. Imani was universally lauded as a hero, a symbol of grace under fire, her professionalism and moral clarity celebrated. Commentators praised her for not only saving a life, but for delivering a masterclass in confronting bigotry. For Caroline Covington, the backlash was swift and brutal. She was publicly identified, and the court of public opinion delivered a verdict far harsher than any she might have faced on the plane. She was excoriated, turned into a digital effigy of privileged racist entitlement. Her face was everywhere, a meme for modern-day bigotry. But the true hard karma was just beginning. It turned out that Caroline Covington was not just a wealthy housewife. She was the founder and chairwoman of the Covington Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar charitable organization renowned for its work in funding arts and education programs. As the video went viral, investigative journalists began digging into the foundation's practices. What they found was a damning pattern. The Covington Foundation, under Caroline's leadership, overwhelmingly awarded its prestigious grants to institutions and individuals that were predominantly white. Artists of color educational programs in minority communities and scholars from historically black colleges were systematically overlooked and underfunded. The accusations that the tech entrepreneur had seen in the news were just the tip of the iceberg. Now, with the video of Caroline's own blatant racism as the backdrop, the Foundation's discriminatory practices were cast in a new, undeniable light. The private prejudice she displayed on the plane was a direct reflection of the systemic bias she enforced in her professional life. The scandal was catastrophic. Major corporate donors pulled their funding. Members of the board of directors, horrified by the public association with such overt racism, demanded her resignation. Protesters gathered outside the Foundation's gleaming Manhattan headquarters. Within 2 weeks, Caroline Covington was forced to step down in disgrace from the very organization she had built her legacy, not one of philanthropy, but of prejudice. Her name, once a symbol of high society and charitable giving, was now permanently stained. The The reputation she had spent a lifetime building was utterly destroyed. Meanwhile, Dr. Imani Hayes' life was transforming in ways she had never imagined. Job offers poured in from the most prestigious hospitals in the country. She was invited on morning talk shows not as a victim, but as an inspiration. She handled the newfound fame with the same quiet dignity and grace she had shown on the plane, consistently redirecting the conversation from her own heroism to the broader issues of systemic racism in medicine and society. Then came the most unexpected twist of all. The Covington Foundation, in a desperate attempt to salvage its reputation and reform its image, dissolved its old board and brought in new leadership. Their first act was to announce the creation of a new multi-million-dollar initiative, the Dr. Imani Hayes Fellowship for Equity in Medicine. Its mission was to provide full scholarships and mentorship opportunities for promising medical students from underrepresented minority backgrounds, and they offered the position of executive director of the fellowship, the person who would shape its mission and guide its future, to Imani herself. After much consideration, she accepted. She realized she could save more lives by tackling the systemic inequities that create people like Caroline Covington than she could by just working in the ER. She could use the platform born from a moment of personal humiliation to effect real, lasting change, ensuring that future generations of doctors who looked like her would not have to endure the same fight for respect. The ultimate karma was not just that Caroline lost everything. It was that the very foundation of her power, the source of her wealth and influence, was now being used to dismantle the very bigotry she embodied. Her name was scrubbed from the letterhead, but her money was now funding the dreams of the very people she had spent her life looking down upon, all under the leadership of the black woman she had tried and failed to break. It was a verdict more profound than any court could deliver, a final cosmic balancing of the scales. The story of Flight 226 is a stark reminder that in the enclosed space of an airplane cabin, just as in the world, our true character is revealed not by our status, but by how we treat those we deem beneath us. Caroline Covington's wealth and privilege couldn't protect her from her own body's betrayal, and in her moment of greatest need, she was forced to rely on the grace of a woman she had viciously attacked. Dr. Imani Hayes showed us that true strength isn't just about professional skill. It's about maintaining your humanity in the face of inhumanity. It's a powerful lesson in how prejudice can blind us and how compassion can quite literally be life-saving. What happened next became a perfect real-life story of karma, where one woman's downfall became the foundation for another's rise, creating positive change for countless others. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that matter. And in the comments below, tell us, have you ever witnessed a moment where karma delivered its verdict so perfectly? We want to hear your stories. Thank you for listening.